Okay, we have made it to Exodus. So if you got your Bible, we finished Genesis last week. I don't know how many weeks it took us. It took us a while, but obviously it's one of the foundational books of the Bible. It lays the foundation for much of the rest of the book, as we saw. Exodus is really no different. There would probably be a discussion about which book was more foundational to what comes after it between the two. Exodus chapter 1 is where we will naturally begin. If you remember, at the end of Genesis, when Genesis ends, Joseph has welcomed down Israel, Jacob and his sons and their family. About 70 of them have come down to Egypt. They have been given the best land, the land of Goshen, where they were able to be prosperous. And Pharaoh liked them because he liked Joseph. They were in good standing, treated well by the Egyptians. Happily ever after, it seems, when Genesis ends. And so, Exodus begins in verse 1. These are the names of the sons of Israel. And it gives all the names. Verse 6, or verse 5. All the descendants of Jacob were 70 persons. Joseph was already in Egypt. And then Joseph died, and all his brothers, and all that generation. But the people of Israel were fruitful and increased greatly. They multiplied and grew exceedingly strong, so the land was filled with them. Verse 8. Now there arose a new king over Egypt who did not know Joseph. And he said to his people, Behold, the people of Israel are too many and too mighty for us. That's made reference to in the New Testament as well, that the new king rose up in Exodus who didn't know Joseph, and he looks around at all the Israelites, sees them as a threat, and decides he must deal with them. That's an interesting thing in itself, the fact that he forgot Joseph, this guy who literally was the savior of Egypt, right? Without Joseph, there wouldn't have been an Egypt, much less a Mediterranean as a whole. He was the one who knew the famine was coming and so prepared for it. He was second in command beside Pharaoh, and who knows how quickly, but all of a sudden we have this new king who doesn't know anything about Joseph, who didn't know Joseph. We have a lesson here probably, which would tie to our modern world, about the detriment of forgetting history, of forgetting where we have come from, forgetting those that go before us, tearing down those statues, whatever you want to call it. It's interesting to think about what would have happened nationally for Egypt if they would have remembered Joseph and continued to treat the Israelites well. Right? Just thinking historically, what would have happened for Egypt? How would it have gone for them if they would have remembered Joseph and thus treated the Israelites well? Look at verse 10, the next verse. Pharaoh says, Come, let us deal shrewdly with the Israelites, lest they multiply. And if war breaks out, they join our enemies, fight against us, and escape from the land. Therefore they set taskmasters over them to afflict them with heavy burdens. They built for Pharaoh store cities, Pithom and Ramses. Okay, so he says, we're going to oppress them so that they don't multiply, lest they multiply and become greater. So he oppresses them. Verse 12, but the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied. That's fascinating. The more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied. We've seen one of the motifs, one of the themes we've seen repeatedly already in, that one's no good, in the Bible, in Genesis and now in Exodus, is that very often burdens are the pathway to growth. All right, we saw it with each main character in some sense in Genesis. We see it already here. It says, because they were burdened, they multiplied. Despite the fact that Pharaoh did what he could to stop their multiplying, their growing as a nation, they didn't. This is the first time that the phrase the people of Israel is used ever. Right? They are now a nation. They're not just 70 people that are part of a family. They have become a people. They have become a people worthy of being called the people of Israel and referred to in that sort of national language. And it'll be used a lot. But it's a consistent motif in the Bible. Right? It's not hidden in the shadows. It is clear in the Bible that we tend to grow when things are difficult. And again, we see that here with the Israelites. And it's interesting as well to ask, what if, right? What if the Israelites never would have been persecuted? Right? They went through long periods of persecution, of suffering, of hardship. What if that wouldn't happen? What if life would have remained good there for the Israelites? Right? We looked at it from the Egyptian side. Now the alternative. What if life would have remained good for the Israelites in Egypt? What if they would have continued to be treated well? Maybe they would have started mixing with the Egyptians and marrying. That likely would have happened. It seems like they would have stayed there. There would have been no reason for them to leave or head towards the land that God had promised. They were happy as it was in Egypt. Maybe they wouldn't have multiplied so greatly and become the great nation that they eventually become. And so we see God's sovereignty working here, but He's working amidst very difficult times, right? And we see that in some real sense. The only way the Israelites ever end up in Canaan is if they're persecuted in Egypt. That the persecution was the way toward toward Canaan. That if there was no persecution, they would have remained in Egypt. And so in some sense, the persecution was good in that it was necessary for the ultimate good. It's crucial that we see in the Bible that the goal of the human life is not what we'll call good times. Right? The goal of the human life is not just to make your life as easy as possible and then sit back and relax. The goal, you've heard of the cycle of history that says strong men make good times make weak men make hard times make strong men. We had this idea that the goal of our lives is the good times, that's the goal, right? But we know that we know through history and through everything else and through the Bible that good times, that times that are just easy, tend to make weak men. Men just being mankind tend to make weak mankind, weak people, and that men are made strong in general by difficulty and by hardship. I want my children to face difficulty because I love them. I don't want everything to come easy for them. Me and Caleb had a fun conversation on the podcast a couple weeks ago about leaving a legacy for your kids. And there's a modern idea of pretty modern, very secular, but leaving a legacy, meaning primarily leaving a financial inheritance, is what's most time meant. And if you're on YouTube or if you're on modern platforms, you hear a lot of talk about generational wealth, leaving generational wealth for your kids. And I get it, and there's some stuff there, but like the Bible is very clear that it's more difficult to enter the kingdom of heaven if you're rich. The Bible is very clear that very often riches are a hindrance to your spirituality more than poverty is. It's clear that riches are difficult, and so it's an odd thing to say, I want to make my kids rich. I want them to be rich when I know that is more difficult spiritually than it is not to be rich. Same thing. I know almost always, like just to use a concrete example, almost always, if there's this is a good example. Dad talked about, I was talking to PJ about this the other day, that if he has an opportunity to hire two people and they're both about the same and one was an athlete in college and one wasn't, he hires the athlete because their life was harder in college. They had to learn how to juggle more things. Things were more difficult. And he knows that because they face more difficulty, they're going to be almost always a better employee. And we just know that in life, right? People that have faced more difficulty very often are more mature, not thrown back and forth by what the world brings, but are more settled and secure. To be like, a lot of people my age stress a lot about making sure that they pay for every dollar of their kid's college, right? And I get that. That's a wonderful thing. But was it such a bad thing for your kid to have to work and to learn the difficulty of that striving? I didn't have to work in college. I worked as a youth minister, but it didn't require much of me. It was really easy. And I had a lot of free time, and I wasted a bunch of time because I had all that free time. And I didn't learn all the things I could have. Right? And so obviously there's pluses on both sides, but just there's things I think we take for granted in our culture and say, well, it's better if you make things easier for your kids. But that's an assumption that's hard to back up biblically. Right? I mean, you want to love your kids, you want them to have a good life, but you also want your kids to face difficulty. You also want them to struggle a bit. You want them to go through hardship. You want them to face things that are going to make them stronger because you know that's how you were made stronger. You know that you are who you are primarily because you face difficulty. We have that question often in our minds, why does God let me face pain? Why does God let me hurt? Well, because He loves you, very often is the answer. Right? Very often the answer is because He loves you and He wants more for you than just your temporary happiness. And He is doing more things than you could possibly know. because he's making you into something beautiful. And you, as I am, humans, we're like metal. We don't tend to be molded until we've been in the fire for a while. That's just how we are. It's often difficult, if not impossible, to mold us when things are easy. It's when things are difficult. So we have this very clear biblical truth already that in general, burdens equal growth, right? Just like when you work out, when you go to the gym and work out, the way you get stronger is by putting more weight on the bar and making it harder on yourself. That is true of everything in life, in general. And that's one of the very clear motifs in the Bible early, is that when we are burdened is when God is with us to help us grow. We also have here that the Israelites are strangers in a strange land looking forward to their homeland. Alec Motyer, who's one of the best Old Testament, particularly Exodus, Bible commentators, says that the story of the Exodus, the book of the Exodus, the story of the Exodus, the story of Israelites in Egypt and coming out of it is the greatest illustration in the history of the world. And what he means by, not that it's not true, of course it's true, but what he means by that is we get a picture in this book in Exodus of all kinds of things about the Christian life. And we start here with strangers in a strange land, longing for a homeland, just like we are that. And in this book of Exodus, you're going to see the life of the Israelites kind of mirror what it is to be saved and to follow Christ and all those things. Okay, thoughts on that? Any of that stuff? Yes, doctor.
So you say that, this new king rose up and he didn't remember Joseph.
Yeah.
Okay, but if you think about it, we think that happened suddenly.
Yeah.
It would have been like, it's equivalent to us thinking about who was Ronald Reagan's vice president and what are his kids doing now?
Yeah, I think there's some parallel there, but the vice president didn't save the nation, right? The vice president wasn't the one who was chiefly responsible for saving America.
The vice president did back then?
Well, but that's fair. I don't know what the vice president did.
Yeah. No, nobody knows.
Yeah, but it seems like
And they would have given all the credit to Pharaoh, not to Joseph.
for saving the nation.
Yeah.
Yeah, maybe so. Even then, it's its own little pitfalls.
A lot more time passes in this.
Yeah, we don't know. Right, we don't know it's a direct Pharaoh. Right, that's right. Yep. We don't know how long exactly goes on. But, and however you want to word it, like if Joseph was given the sort of veneration that he deserved to be given, then he would be remembered the same way George Washington was hundreds of years later, or whoever else was a great character of history that played a significant role in the salvation of the nation. Other thoughts? Yes?
I was just listening to something today that said that the average age of the Israelites at the time that they were in Egypt and being oppressed was 35. And if that is, if there's any truth to that, even more so that they still thrived and grew and were even stronger. Like it's even more.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah, I don't know. I don't know. I don't know about the ages. What else? Anything on that? Burdens to growth? Anything like that?
I think it's hard to watch, as a parent, to watch your children struggle.
For sure.
I mean, you know it's best for them,
Oh, for sure.
just like God knows it's best to let us struggle,
Yeah, but it doesn't make it any easier.
but it doesn't make it any easier.
Yeah, right. No doubt. No doubt. There's some sanctifying work going on in us as well when that's going on. All right, let's look at the next kind of topic here. Look at verse 15. So they're being worked as slaves. Verse 15, the king of Egypt, Pharaoh, said to the Hebrew midwives, that we'll come back to that in a moment, said to the Hebrew midwives, one of whom was named Shiphrah and the other Puah, when you serve as midwife to the Hebrew women and see them on the birth stool, if it's a son, you shall kill him, but if it's a daughter, she shall live. But the midwives feared God and did not do as the king of Egypt commanded them, but let the male children live. So the king of Egypt called the midwives and said to them, why have you done this and let the male children live? The midwives said to Pharaoh, because the Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women, for they are vigorous and give birth before the midwife comes to them. So God dealt well with the midwives, and the people multiplied and grew very strong. And because the midwives fear God, he gave them families. And Pharaoh commanded all his people, every son that's born of the Hebrews, you shall cast into the Nile. We have what is considered here and what it is, the first example of godly civil disobedience, of disobeying the government and getting the godly thumbs up for doing so. This is actually, it's a pretty significant topic in that the Bible is clear that Christians in general should be good citizens, right? A couple of passages, Romans 13, probably the main one that comes to mind. Romans 13, you can turn with me or you can just listen. It says in the first verses, "Let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there's no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God. Therefore, whoever resists the authorities resists what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment." Look at 1 Peter 2. The whole chapter is about that, by the way, Romans 13, but we won't read it all. 1 Peter 2, verse 13. It says, "Be subject to the Lord for the Lord's sake to every human institution, whether it be to the emperor as supreme or to governors as sent by him to punish those who do evil and praise those who do good, for this is the will of God," etc. Okay, so we know that, and it's been that way from the beginning, that people of God are intended to be good citizens almost always. That we are intended to be those who obey the law almost always. And there's always been Christian discussion about what is the line, right? What is the line where we can become those who are disobedient to the government and be obedient to God? Because most often, when you're disobedient to the government, you're disobedient to God. But it's not always, right? And obviously, we came face to face with this in 2020 with COVID, when the government said churches can't meet. And we had less of that here than like California and Canada. But we came face to face with that reality, and a lot of nuance there and how to handle those situations. Much of it was similar, like if the government said there's a hurricane coming, so you may not want to meet, and we would heed that, and we're figuring out those things. But it lasted. I think we all agree now that the command to not meet lasted longer than it should. It lasted longer than it should have, and so churches came into this impasse of what do I do? Right? Do I obey Romans 13 and submit to the government, or do we not neglect meeting together? Do we get together as a church? And so there was a lot of discussion around churches around the country, and there weren't any, to my knowledge, imprisonments in America, but there were in Canada. Multiple pastors, ministers that were imprisoned because they refused to stop meeting. And this is well into COVID, like in August of that year, September, October. These men were thrown in prison because they had started meeting back and they refused to stop meeting. And so there was a lot of discussion amongst Christians. I remember struggling with this. A lot of discussion among Christians about how exactly do we deal with Romans 13, 1 Peter 2, submit to the authorities while also not neglecting to obey God. The traditional answer to that is that it has been that we obey the government until it forbids what God commands or commands what God forbids. And that's a pretty good rule. We obey the government until the government commands what God forbids or forbids what God commands. And then, but again, with COVID there, you get difficulty because God commands us to meet together, and they were forbidding it. And so there's some tough things. But there's been, in history, basically two ways of seeing authority and the way that authority works, right? God has given authority to the government, and God has given authority to the church. We see that in Scripture. God's given authority to the government and authority to the church. And there's been basically two ways of seeing that, naturally. One is called the papist way, it doesn't matter what they're called, but is that government authority is above church authority in general. That it takes priority over church authority, or that's Erastian rather. And then the opposite, the alternative, is that the church is over the government. And if you know your history, you know that, well, we've seen both of those, right? When the Roman Catholic Church was appointing the emperor, they were over the government. Really, modern world, the government is considered to be over the church. It seems to be biblically that they are, the government and the church are more placed beside each other as two kind of separate spheres, that the church submits to the government and the government should, in some sense, submit to the church. But regardless, a lot of interesting things there. And here is the first time in the Scriptures that we ever have, there's not a ton of them, but this is the first time we ever have someone who disobeys the government and does it appropriately, the way that God intended for them to do. Okay, interesting question here. We haven't left this yet. Interesting question here is these midwives, were they Hebrews or were they Egyptians? Were they Hebrews or were they Egyptians? Look again, verse 15. And I'll explain why that's interesting in a minute. Then the king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, and the language there just says that the midwives of the Hebrews. That is, the midwives who acted as midwives for the Hebrews. And it's neutral in that it could be Egyptian midwives who did the midwiving for the Hebrews. It could be the Hebrews themselves. There's an interesting discussion there. So one side would say that the midwives are probably Egyptian because Pharaoh is commanding them to kill Hebrew babies and expects them to do it, which would be an odd thing if they were Hebrews. He gets on to them and gets mad at them for not doing it, which would be weird if they were Hebrews. The midwife said to Pharaoh, verse 19, because the Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women, for they are vigorous and give birth. It doesn't say we are vigorous and give birth. Right? So there's some reasons to think maybe they were Egyptian. If they were, what we have here is an example of people who weren't part of the Hebrew nation, but who glorified God by the way they lived. Right? People who weren't Israelites, but who were pleasing to God, who God accepted and God blessed because of their obedience. Okay, they may be Egyptians. They also may be Hebrews. If they're Hebrews, then Jonathan Pageau makes an interesting point. He says what's happening here, if they're Hebrews, is that Pharaoh is giving the women the power over the men of Israel. He was putting the sword in the women's hands to take control of their nation over the men, that they had the ability they were going to kill out all the men so the women could take charge, which has been an issue from the beginning. It's an issue again today, to feminize the nation and thereby make it less threatening to Pharaoh and to his will. Either way, so I don't know. It's not conclusive which one it is. They could be Hebrew midwives, but either way it teaches us something, either about foreign people who glorified God or about the danger of the feminizing of society, of women killing the men and thus hurting themselves in the process. Thoughts on that? Okay, so we have this. There's one of the clearest things we have in the first chapters of Exodus is this dichotomy between Pharaoh as the most powerful man in the world, which he was, and God. There's this back and forth of Pharaoh versus God for the first chapters of Exodus, about Egypt. And there's this question here that's asked repetitively, which one do you want to be on the side of? Right? Would you rather be on the side of Pharaoh or on the side of God? Because these midwives are put in that position. Do I choose to be on the side of Pharaoh, the most powerful man in the world, or do I choose to be on the side of God? And they chose to be on the side of God, and because of that, they were blessed for it. So there's this kind of choice given consistently throughout the book of Exodus of whose will you be? Will you be Pharaoh's, or will you be God's? Will you be of the world, even in its power, in its glory, in its pomp and circumstance, or will you be God's? The end of chapter 1 ends like this, verse 22. Then Pharaoh commanded all his people, every son that's born to the Hebrews, you shall cast into the Nile, but you shall let every daughter live. Again, that's interesting, right? He doesn't say kill every baby, which would have wiped out the nation. And it's not that he just wants to keep some slaves around, because men were much better slaves. He says, kill all the men. The daughters can live, kill all the boys. Chapter 2 brings us to our main character for the book of Exodus. Verse 1, besides Jesus and God, which is the Bible school answer, but it is the right answer. Everything being about him. Now a man from the house of Levi went and took as his wife a Levite woman. The woman conceived and bore a son. Now, that seems like nothing, but it's something. We're talking about Moses' parents. Moses, who is probably the most significant figure in the Old Testament. The Savior of Israel. The one who would speak to God, who would receive the Ten Commandments on the Mount Sinai, who would see the face of God and come down with his face shining, who would stand in the Red Sea and the waters would part, who would speak to Pharaoh and lead his people free. We're talking about Moses, perhaps the greatest Israelite before Jesus that ever lived. And here's how he's introduced. Here's how his parents are mentioned. A man from the house of Levi took as his wife a Levite woman. That's what we get. They're nobody, right? Nobody special. They're not kings, they're not princes, they're not of royal blood. It's just, they're not even from the tribe of Judah. They're not from the tribe of, they're from the Levi tribe. They're just people. And from those just people comes the greatest figure in the Old Testament outside of Christ himself or God himself. So we have this, what's referred to as a lowly birth or a humble birth motif. Lowly birth or humble birth. And if you're a Christian, which you are, then you see one of those crimson threads, again, that pulls us to the New Testament, that this is a consistent theme of God, that he takes that which is lowly and makes it glorious, that he takes that which is nothing and makes it something, and of course that Christ would come as the lowly birth ultimately in the manger and would be exalted to the place at the right hand of the King, right hand of God the Father. So we see that with Moses as well. This man of nothing becoming royalty. And just, so rich. This is your story as well, right? This is the story of being adopted into God's kingdom, is that you are nothing and yet are adopted by the God of the universe and welcomed into the house of the King. In the same way that Moses is nothing but finds his way floating down a river to being adopted into the house of the King, to being alongside the house of the King and the King himself. So all these crimson threads that we're going to see in the book of Exodus that pull us to the reality of our salvation, the reality of Christ. We see it with Moses here as well. The man from the humble place who finds himself adopted by the King. That is you, dear Christian, and that is me. And of course, it's Christ as well. And then there's also this kind of dual parenthood thing where his parents are normal parents, but also his parents are in Egypt divine, right? Pharaoh was divine. Pharaoh was God, was a God. And so now his new parents are like divine. They're the greatest of all parents, while his normal parents are common and normal. And for Christians, for us, that all of us have normal parents, common human parents, and yet all the time, and not just Christians, everyone, our ultimate parent is God. Our ultimate Father is the God of the heavens and the King. And we see all that there in the first bit of Exodus. Verse 3, when she could hide him no longer, she hid him 3 months. When she could hide him no longer, she took for him a basket made of bulrushes and daubed it with bitumen and pitch. She put the child in it and placed it among the reeds by the riverbank. Your version may say took an ark, made an ark instead of a basket. That is the same word as ark. It's the same word used in Genesis 6 about the boat Noah built. That an ark, Moses was placed in an ark, and once again the world is saved by an ark via water. Our people of God are saved again by a kid in an ark that's floating down the water, heading to his home, heading to the King. Okay, any thoughts before we do one more thing?
Reason why he wasn't tagged to be killed?
At what point? After he floats up. Well, he was, but it just says his mom hid him. So she did a good job of hiding that he was born, hiding him from anyone who wished him harm. But it's a very interesting point in that she sends him down the river, and then what happens? Right? Look at Exodus 2, verse 5. We have some more of that civil disobedience, some God-glorifying civil disobedience. Verse 4, the basket floats up. Sister stands off. Verse 5, the daughter of Pharaoh came down to bathe at the river, while her young women walked beside the river. She saw the basket among the reeds and sent her servant woman, and she took it. When she opened it, she saw the child, and behold, the baby was crying. She took pity on him and said, this is one of the Hebrews' children. Then his sister said to Pharaoh's daughter, here's what she asked, shall I go and call you a nurse from the Hebrew women to nurse the child from you? Why did she not say, shall I kill it? Because that's what she had just been charged to do. Right? Pharaoh himself had charged all of the Egyptians, had given them the command, you kill all the baby boys. And now here, the daughter of Pharaoh finds a baby boy. All she got to do is turn the basket over. It would have taken very little effort. Do you want me to kill him? That's not what she says. Right? The servant says, do you want me to go find a Hebrew midwife, a Hebrew mother who can nurse the child for you? Right? So again, we have this civil disobedience, this disobeying of the government, which of course is good and of course is right. And we see that this desire for life and to preserve infants, to preserve the innocent, to preserve life is a good thing that's above any command. Right? We don't need the Ten Commandments to tell us that. We don't need any sort of written down command. Pharaoh's daughter didn't need someone to tell her that it was good to save a baby. She just knew it. Right? It was just in her. It transcends any sort of commands by Pharaoh. Right? It is good to obey the government. That's a good thing in general. And yet, when we read the story and see that Pharaoh's daughter saved the baby, we go, well, of course that's better. Of course that's what she should have done. Right? And she does that. She shows that there's this moral law in her that transcends just the laws of her king. There's this moral law in her that is higher than that transcends the laws of the Pharaoh, even if that Pharaoh is her father. And so again, we have the Egyptian women here placed in the same spot as the midwives, who have the capacity to kill the young men, to obey the command, but instead take compassion. And again, over and over in the first chapters, women are the heroes. Again, these women are the heroes, where the man was being the tyrant, the man was being evil in Pharaoh. The women saved the babies, and then the women saved the babies. And they place compassion appropriately on these infants. And they do it again here, saving the child. One more thing, and then you can ask her whatever, or we'll be done. Verse 10, we'll finish this little section. You know that by God's sovereignty, the servant goes to the Hebrews, ends up going to Moses' actual mother, and Moses' mother nurses Moses for years. So she ends up having the baby for multiple years and taking care of him. Verse 10, when the child grew up, that's his biological mother, when the child grew up, she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. She named him Moses because she said, I drew him out of the water. It's interesting and obviously personal for me in that Egypt had already kind of a program of adoption, for lack of a better word. The adoption was a thing. You could adopt another child and become your child in full regard, to receive inheritance if you didn't have older children, all those things. And the idea here in verse 10, it says he became her son, using all the same language of biological becoming, all the same language of biological sonship, and even later Jews refer to Pharaoh's daughter as the mother of Moses, right? And so she adopts the child for the child's good, or the child never could have grown up with Moses' mother, he would have been killed. She adopts the child becomes her child via adoption, and there is no difference in the Bible to the Egyptians, to the Hebrews, in the adopted children versus the biological children, which I think is, of course, pretty awesome. Okay, any thoughts on any of that? We'll stop there today. Any thoughts, comments, statements, remarks, disagreements, debates, additions, omissions, etc.?